issues you might have. Now, I'd like to hand it over to a pre-recording with our speaker, Connie Mosley. Thank you, Connie.
And hello, everyone. Wow, there's a fair amount of people on there. That's a bit stressful. But we're so thrilled to be part of the VET conference today and tomorrow. And we hope you get to learn something about this fascinating system and its therapeutic potential. This morning, I will bring to you the basics of the endocannabinoid system and about the plant. Unfortunately, I have to admit, there's nothing basic about the endocannabinoid system. It is incredibly complex. But it is also really fascinating. So don't be overwhelmed. I do hope you have a strong matcha tea or like espresso-like coffee, not the Tim Hortons stuff, but you know, like some really good coffee to keep on with me. So hopefully what I figured what we should do is, oh wait, can I get this one? Yeah, so what we're gonna do is talk about the endocannabinoid system, its physiology and its pathophysiology, just to understand then how the cannabis plant works on that system and how our own system works. So as we know, the endocannabinoid system is like a very, like in a way a newer system, but one of the most abandoned receptor systems in our body. So it is quite fascinating to learn more about it. It has been, I mean, with all the botanical medicine and herbs, we know that there was early discovery of like medicinal properties of all sorts of different plants, including the cannabis plant. The ancient cultures, India and like Greece, China, have easily discovered that there is some good components to this plant and other plants. But they really, like on the Western side, the CBD was, or like the whole endocannabinoid system was only kind of discovered in the 80s. And it was very similar, like, you know how we discovered the opioid system and all the receptors thanks to like, you know, the opium poppy that was around and people got high on that one. Or like that whole anti-inflammatory system with the prostaglandins was discovered and based on the willow bark because they discovered there's some anti-inflammatory components to that plant. So not much different to the cannabis plant. So we found a plant that seems to work and then go like, okay, what is it actually working on? So in the 30s, CBD was isolated from the plant. But then kind of, you know, the real discovery was only in the 60s and 70s, as you can imagine, of the times, right? It has been extensively researched over the last 30, 40 years, 50 years. And there's been more and more coming out about that. In general, the endocannabinoid system, the strategy, like with any physiology and any systems in our body, is pretty much to keep it healthy, right? Helps the cells and the tissues and the organs to reestablish, and physiology that keeps us healthy, especially, and kind of like make things normal when there is an imbalance or an impact, either acute or chronic. What we kind of say about the endocannabinoid system is trying to keep us healthy in a way of eating, sleeping, relaxing, forgetting, and protecting ourselves. It actually, as I mentioned before, it is the most abandoned receptor system in our body, which is really fascinating and kind of scary that we don't actually know anything about it and that we don't learn anything about it in veterinary school. I think only now we're starting to kind of add that to our physiology classes. It is well recognized in all mammalians and pretty much any animals out there besides the insects. So they are probably the only ones who don't have an endocannabinoid system. As we said, it has been researched, but nothing was coming out on papers because of the whole, and Dr. Silcox will talk about that, because of the regulatory issues of being a bad drug in a sense. The complexity of how it interplays with the physiology and the pathophysiology of other systems, that continues to be discovered as we speak, and it is quite fascinating, and you can go into a rabbit hole trying to understand it. So we'll try not to do that, although that's always hard for me because I love rabbit holes. So the endocannabinoid system in general, as we kind of said with the whole eat, sleep, forget, you can kind of like figure out like the nervous system, the metabolic systems, including like the digestive system. reproductive system and the immune function are highly kind of there. That's where it plays a huge role. So you can see that there's receptors all over the bodies and all sorts of organs everywhere. And if you kind of do a Google image search of the endocannabinoid system, you'll find all sorts of things in that way. 16 or 15 years ago, like there's already like the idea of like, hey, we have this endocannabinoid system. How can we use it for pharmacotherapy, especially in a preventative way? As you can see, this is the Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. And considering that we have the opioid crisis is why I think all that research is coming out trying to figure out how can we treat chronic pain, how can we treat some of the other refractory diseases that we're not getting anywhere. And we're having a huge problem with pharmaceutical opioid situations in this point. And the discoveries on how to treat that or how prevent it kind of brought it back to the endocannabinoid system. So we had to bring it out from under the rugs. Most research probably is the neuro disorders, so CNS disorders. That includes MS, plays a huge role, Alzheimer's, epilepsy, even depression and insomnia are like big ones where the endocannabinoid system and treatment with cannabis can help, and where the studies have been quite significant, including this also includes drug addiction. And I think that's where, you know, we see a lot of research happening for that. The other ones, as you know, when your clients ask about cannabis for their pets, is pain and inflammation, as well as cancer. And then cancer includes also the cachexia and anorexia from the chemo-related side effects of not eating and losing weight. So these ones are probably the 3 or 4 biggest ones in the research area, but there is also the irritable bowel disease, and we'll get to that in a little bit, as well as asthma, osteoporosis, and osteoarthritis probably goes more into the pain and inflammation. So why all this one works on so many systems is where we're gonna get into. So got to get your coffee ready. The endocannabinoid system, just to keep it really basic, I promised basic, we'll start with basic, would be your CB1 receptor, like the 2 receptors that are the main ones for the endocannabinoid system. So CB1 and the cannabinoid receptor 2, CB2 receptor. And then we have our endogenous, our own ligands that go on these receptors, which are the endocannabinoids that are our neurotransmitters, just like GABA is, like glutamate is in our body. That would be anandamide and 2-AG. With that, because we have to somewhat metabolize those ones, would be your metabolizing enzymes, the FAH and MGL. And I'm not even going to go into these names because it just like takes more minutes out of my talk. So FAH and MGL it is, okay? So the endocannabinoid receptor 1, so CB1 receptor, is the one in the brain that, first of all, yes, provides good analgesia, but also is in charge when you use it recreational for the psychopharmacological effects of THC. Its primary role is pretty much to inhibit these other neurotransmitters to decrease the excitability. They are, when you look at the pain pathway, everywhere. So they're in the brain, they're in the dorsal root ganglion, and they're in the periphery. And if I kind of look at that on this picture, like you see how the pain pathway, you get your injection, like your pain here, it gets sent to the dorsal horn, into the spinal cord, and then sent to the brain. And you can see that both of these, CB1 and CB2 receptors, are in the periphery, on the dorsal root ganglion, in the spinal cord, and on all sorts of areas in the brain. So we have these receptors everywhere. What the receptor does, the endocannabinoids like that anandamide and 2-AG are produced on demand on the postsynaptic area, and then activates that CB1 receptor, and then retrograde, it kind of says, okay, don't let any neurotransmitters go through. So if you want to look at that at the chart, because that's much easier, I'm a very visual learner. So you have this green area here with where my little arrow is, that's the CB1 receptor. This is kind of the signal that goes in, that's your synapses, And so if you go back to, let's go to here. So what we're doing here is like we're sending the signal into the spinal cord, the pain signal, and then it kind of gets through the synapses to be sent out. So this is where we at. So a signal comes in, which opens up the calcium channels and tells like GABA and glutamate to be released, to go on the other side and say, there was a pain signal, I've got to send it to the brain because I'm a bit of a tatty-taller. So that release of glutamate will then release those endocannabinoids on this side of the synapses, which goes back to the CB1 receptor, and the CB1 receptor says, that's it, no more glutamate or GABA going across. This is not allowed, so that we can decrease the pain that goes up. So that's your own system telling you, okay, you're overreacting on the pain, let's decrease that one. So makes sense? So it blocks everything in that sense. And same with the anandamide, it gets released, it goes on the receptor, and then it goes on this side and gets metabolized to arachidonic acid and ethanolamine. So other locations, instead of just pain for the CB1 receptor, obviously it's in the brain, but it's also in the brain for the anti-emetic effect on the nucleus or solitary tract. So that's why it works well for the anti-emetic components of chemotherapy, for example. It's on the motor cortex and motor neuron of spinal cord. This is where the MS kind of plays a huge role for the treatment of that. So the CB1 receptor plays a big role there. There's a component for glaucoma. So I'm just kind of like telling you where it is and where the clinical impact it would be. The enteric nervous system, GI, big times, irritable bowel disease, any in that. The immune system, and other peripheral sites. So they're pretty much everywhere. And in the way they work is exactly how I showed you on this graph, is like, okay, we're done. Like whatever you're trying to excitatory send in, stop it. So one example, for example, because we know in epilepsy, like it's usually a total chaos of glutamate release, right? Like, so that excitatory of it's one of the components, not all, it's not that simple, but it is one of the components where glutamate is playing in such excitatory craziness that, you know, with the CB1 receptor activation, it blocks that. And that's why the endocannabinoid system plays a huge role, or is kind of like mediated by those CB1 receptors. Unfortunately, the CB1 receptors are also kind of like not movable, but changeable with the upregulation of like constant seizures. But what we're trying to do with the cannabis and the epilepsy is block that glutamate release to decrease the amount and the frequency as well as the duration of seizures. Does that make sense for this receptor? I hope so. So then we have the CB2 receptor. So the CB2 receptor was always thought to be mainly an immunomodulatory receptor. So it is mainly in the presence of immune systems. And a while back, it wasn't detected in a healthy brain. The fascinating part about the CB2 receptor is that it is everywhere as well, but it is highly inducible. It shows up when there is an injury or during inflammation. So the CB2 receptor expression increases up to 100-fold after any of those tissue inflammations. So it shows up to trying to prevent that inflammation from happening. Because we know that most of those neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, dementia, they are all neurodegenerative, like inflammatory, like have an inflammatory immune-mediated component to it. So that's where they plays a huge role to activate that CB2 receptor and block that from kind of like making any activity. So the CB2 receptor is largely involved in regulating the immune system and any inflammatory condition. Makes sense, right? It gets upregulated, so it's helping trying to the immune system to settle back down again. And cannabis and any cannabinoid will help support that. So for example, so rheumatoid arthritis is a typical, very immune-mediated inflammatory situation, right? So rheumatoid arthritis has a chronic inflammation of the synovium. The cartilage gets destructed and you're even losing bone loss due to the cytokine production from an influx of like, you know, like inflammatory cells. So the acetate class gets so aggravated, and that causes bone resorption. So what they found, and this is, I'm throwing a couple of papers in there just for you to kind of say, hey, that's cool, I want to read about it. So then that's a starting point. And most of them are actually review papers. So because they're easier to read, and then you can dwell into like any of the other studies. Anywho, the endocannabinoid, so if you have patients with the rheumatoid arthritis, they actually have shown to have those endocannabinoids, so anandamide and 2-AG, present in the synovial fluids. That is not the case for normal or patients with normal joints and not rheumatoid arthritis. The expression of the gene kind of like situation for CB1 and CB2 receptors are also found in the synovia. So we have pretty much CB2 receptors showing up there to kind of help the to inhibit that inflammatory process. And those ones, and because of that, it promotes osteoblast differentiation instead of the osteoclast. So instead of actually bone resorption, it's trying to heal the bone. So obviously you can see this is a huge component for those diseases that we're really struggling to get under control with normal medication. Another example is, this one, which is like the Alzheimer's on the left with the blue, and the Parkinson disease. So whenever there is that inflammation in the brain on the microglia for the astrocytes, these CB2 receptors like all kind of pop up trying to help. And on Parkinson's, it will be on the astrocytes. So at the beginning, especially, over time, they are burned out and they don't want to work anymore. But at the beginning, if you use a CB2 agonist, so like something that works on the CB2 receptors, all these things are happening to trying to prevent Alzheimer's to progress that fast, or Parkinson's, or you can relieve some of the symptoms. So there's a lot of interesting components to that. Because of that neuroinflammatory and immune-mediated diseases. So that is quite fascinating, I think. Anywho, so that was the two receptors. So the endocannabinoids are pretty much your endogenous neurotransmitters. They sit in the lipid membranes and get released anytime there's that like signal of like, hey, there's glutamate coming across. And then they kind of are getting processed. I'm just showing you those two, but there's quite a few other ones, but the most studied ones for the basic one would be anandamide and 2-AG. So that's these ones. So the anandamide is a partial agonist on the CB1 receptor, remember the central one, but also in the periphery, but that really blocks everything. It doesn't have much of an efficacy on the CB2 receptor, the one that kind of pops up whenever there's inflammation in immune-mediated diseases. But it has like affinity for other receptors, and we'll get into that are not those two. It will be broken down by the FAAH to arachidonic acid and ethanolamine. 2-AG, on the other hand, is a full agonist on both CB1 and CB2 receptor, and breaks down also to arachidonic acid and glycerol. So that one is a good one, 2-AG, for all these immune-mediated diseases. So you can see with that arachidonic acid, we know that is the big pathway for prostaglandin production and prostanoids and stuff like that. So you can kind of see that there's already kind of an interlink happening. The enzymes would be those two. And the idea was always, if we can block those ones, then we have more of our endocannabinoids around the anandamide and 2-AG to have more effect. Does that make sense? So if I don't block if I do block the degradation of 2-AG, I have more 2-AG around to go on CB1 and CB2 receptor. And for a while, that was like one of the therapeutic kind of like angles the industry was going for. But then they kind of realized that there's a lot of like side effects by having that one, and that got put on hold pretty quickly. And the reason for that is, as I kind of already mentioned, anandamide here, so ignore the top part, but the anandamide works on the CB1, less on the CB2 receptor, but it works also on other receptors. And when it gets metabolized, we have arachidonic acid. There's a whole different other cascade, and directly as well, it has goes via the COX-2 and the LOX pathway as well. So if you're blocking things and have more anandamide around, you have a whole kind of other effects on that one. It's kind of one of those domino effects that kind of when you mess with the physiology. And this is, I'm not even going through it, but this is like not so basic anymore, right? Like this is, you have your receptors and you have all the effects that trigger with it on both sides of the river, of the synapses, on all those different receptors. So messing with one by blocking any of the enzymes has a whole cascade of other things happening. So quite fascinating, but also overwhelmingly complex. And that's where kind of we're going into something like where, you know, we have the endocannabinoid system, but the endocannabinoid system is much more complex than we all anticipated or hoped for when you're trying to read it and trying to understand it. So the endocannabinoids and enzymes interplay a huge role in other physiologic systems. So we could go back to that, but you get the picture, right? So there's a complex buffer system for physiology to prevent any disease or pathophysiology system between all those different crazy and pathways that we have in our body. So what we're kind of saying is if we would degrade or kind of like the endocannabinoid blocking, it will interfere with some other receptors and pathways. So instead of just, so we kind of say the endocannabinoid system is that CB1, CB2, the endocannabinoids and those enzymes, but the endocannabinoidome, the EC-bome, is very much the complexity of all these other receptors included that are related to the endocannabinoid system. So what we call it, it would be the expanded endocannabinoid system. So the not so basic part of it anymore. So all sorts of families of enzymes and mediators that are involved, and they all share and play a role on the components of the endocannabinoid system. And in parts they balance, but they can have opposite effects. We kind of said with the arachidonic acid pathway, right? Like we know they have pro-inflammatory components to it, and they have anti-inflammatory components to it. And that's the same with pro and anti-metabolism. Like we kind of said, we want to treat cachexia and anorexia, but we also want to treat obesity. So you kind of have balancing areas that kind of are very depending on tiny little details. The other receptors that are involved in the endocannabinoidome system is your G proteins. They're all G proteins, just like the opioid receptors. So there's the 1855, there's a bunch of them. The TRPV and TRPA, are like which are the vanilloid receptors, which play a huge role for pain. The serotonin receptors, you know, they play a huge role for pain, but also like memory and any mental issues. Glycine receptors for when you kind of look at brain epilepsy in this area, and the PPRs for like cancer and stuff like that. So for example, the G protein 55 was for long considered to be the CB3 receptor, but it stays with the G protein 55, and it's involved in the cancerous growth. So by blocking that one, it has a huge potential for oncology. But on the other side, it's also densely found on osteoclast. So osteoporosis plays a big role on this one, blocking it. But then you can see it also plays for hypotension, vasodilation. It's in charge of platelet function, fat cell growth, immune system regulation, vitamin D3 metabolism, insulin release, so diabetes. So you can kind of already see like, whoa, I'm done, I'm gonna chap out, right? Like it is overwhelmingly how everything plays together, but so fascinating when you're trying to be able to kind of see how everything is linked together. So again, the endocannabinoid system is just the basic one that you were trying to hear today. And the endocannabinoid system is all that includes anything that the endocannabinoid system is playing with when they go to high school. Recently, we've been working quite a bit, or like seeing quite a bit on the endocannabinoid system and the gut-brain axis. And I think with, you know, some of our foods coming out with the microbiome, we know that the gut-brain axis plays a huge role in physiology and disease prevention. So we know the endocannabinoid system is an important regulator of the intestinal function, and it's trying to get a homeostasis between the brain and the GI system. So because the endocannabinoid system regulates that visceral sensation and the point pain and motility and especially inflammation, it's trying to inhibit the neural activity pathway that goes from the GI system to the brain. So this is a wonderful review and kind of getting a handle of that one. We know with chronic stress, our GI system, like the stress up here in our GI system, they don't really do well, right? Like you get diarrhea when you're highly stressed, or obstipation in other people. And that is linked because your endocannabinoids go up, your enzymes go down, your expression of your CB1 receptor will change as well. So there is a close link on all that one together. The other thing where especially for preventative measures is like having a healthy gut and having a healthy mental disease. And I find that quite fascinating that your probiotics, and I think, you know, like Ethan Russo is one of the big proponents of that one. And this is a wonderful review on that one, Cannabis Therapeutics and the Future of Neurology, because he's very much saying if our gut is not healthy, our brain won't be healthy. And we also have acne. So there's a lot of components that are interlinked together. They kind of did this like interesting study where they had GI, well, they had not Alzheimer's, autistic children where they gave them a fecal transplant, which we do in dogs as well with chronic GI issues, and realized because they had issues with the change of biome and microflora in that child's GI system, their symptoms for their autism actually went down quite significantly for a couple of months. And I find that is like, wow, like that much of an impact it does when we kind of deal with the GI and the mental disease. So instead of like, here's a big component or proponent is like to really say, let's prevent mental disease from happening, but by keeping our GI system healthy, not by like, yes, we can take all this, but even just probiotics, prebiotics, eating healthy instead of all this processed food would make a big difference. Fascinating topics to dwell into. He also is a big, very interested in, or kind of wrote a couple papers on the endocannabinoid deficiency syndrome. That means you're like, if you are one of those poor people who have a lot of migraines, it seems to be that you have decreased levels of endocannabinoids to help those go onto the receptors and get that excitatory neurotransmitters under control. So they found that in the spinal cord and the meninges. So it's kind of interesting how, whoa, okay, so my endocannabinoid system is a little bit deficient, and that's why I'm having some of the issues. So the diseases, for example, with others that have endocannabinoid deficiency syndrome is fibromyalgia, irritable bowel disease, and chronic pain. And that's what he was just saying with this one. Your endocannabinoid system needs a little boost, and you wouldn't have these problems. Which on the other side brings us a little bit into the pharmacogenetics of all that. That means we all are a little bit different on our endocannabinoid tone and what our physiology in our body does. We're a little bit different. And we know, for example, for responders and non-responders, we know that from the opioid things, right? Some respond like heavily in it, and some you can take like 12 hydrocodones and you still don't get any pain relief. So there is a genetic predisposition that we have people responding to certain drugs and not. And that is the same for the cannabinoid treatments. We have a certain basal endocannabinoid tone for our endocannabinoid system. As we kind of said, they can be upregulated or downregulated. That kind of depends on how we're responding to using cannabinoids, or how we are kind of sensitive to pain, to GI issues, to mental disease. We know that with constant expression or constant use of the CB2, of those receptors, that they will be upregulated or downregulated. So there's a lot of like to understand on that one. The patient's response also might change because of you have different metabolism and transformation and transport of those endocannabinoid systems. So we know that the gene expression for CB1 receptor can be very different in different people. And if you have a variance on that CB1 receptor, and it's kind of like a little bit genetically off, there might be a higher incidence of substance dependence and mental disease. So that's kind of fascinating too. And that's the same for the CB2 receptor expression or gene expression. You might be more prone to certain diseases, especially immune-mediated diseases, when you have these kind of like changes in the CB2 receptors. And then you obviously can have like different glucuronidation ability and metabolism issues. So that's kind of interesting. So now you can kind of see where, with all the different disorders, the cannabinoid response can play a role. So that's quite fascinating, right? So you can kind of see where the MS research is going, and Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, even just sleep and pain plays a big role. And if you want to kind of learn more about all these different ones, you'll find some interesting stuff about it. So when you kind of look at now, like you look at different diseases and you want to say, okay, my dog has epilepsy and I really want to figure out what I can do with cannabinoids. There's two things that I kind of like encourage you is like, yes, understanding how epilepsy works in the endocannabinoid system, how epilepsy by itself works as much as we know about it, and how those cannabinoids will change what is happening between disease and physiology. So that brings us to like the cannabinoids per se. So we have the endocannabinoids, which would be your anandamide and 2-AG, and we already talked about them. But the phytocannabinoids is the ones that you wanted to hear about, like so CBD, THC, CBC, CBG, CBN, CBDV, some of the terpenes and the flavonoids. So those ones we want to know now, how do they work on the endocannabinoid system? But let's go back one step. So if we're looking at the cannabis plant and we look at the use and the anatomy of it, we know that the cannabis plant is very versatile. Like first of all, it has been used as like industrial hemp for like lots of areas, right? The stalk is used for textiles, paper, building material. The seeds are worked for, you know, either industrial products like solvents and oil paints, or foods like the hemp seed hearts that I have on my cereal in the morning, and then body care, shampoo and lotions. The leaves are used for animal bedding, and then even the roots play a big role for medicinal part or for organic compost. So we have lots of areas where the hemp area works. What we're trying to figure out, and that's from the Ontario Cannabis Store website, is like the flower, where all the cannabinoids are in there. So the cola is the cluster of buds, all these buds up there that have the highest concentration of cannabinoids and terpenes. And then the trichomes are those glands that found on the cannabis plants on the leaves, and that's why it's sometimes called sugar leaves, the stems and the calyx, and they also secrete some resin, THC, CBD, and terpene in components are in there. So that's kind of the very basic. We know there are different chemovars, and the very basic ones, or the initial ones, were the sativa and the indica, and then the ruderalis, that's more like South Africa, Australia planted. And they are different on how much THC and CBD they have, and what if they are uplifting or more relaxing. So you kind of know most of that already. But what we're trying to figure out is like between the different plants, and Dr. Silcox will go into that a little bit more later about how many the different levels of like cannabinoids in there. Most of the time when we look at the Ontario Cannabis Store, we only know like the levels of THC and CBD in there. But we do want to know more about all the other cannabinoids that are in there, because we kind of said, when you kind of go back here, that we have about 400 active chemical components and 60 different cannabinoids. So THC and CBD are only 2 of them, and not, what are we going to do with the last, let me do the math, 58 ones. So there's lots of those ones around, and obviously we're not going to go in there. In blue are the CBD and THC components, but we have all these ones. So I want to kind of tell you a little bit more about all these ones. The cannabinoids, kind of like, and why there are so many, is not that all of these ones are in the plant. They do a lot of like hybrid chemovore breeding now, in the sense that they're trying to get more of those different cannabinoids in the plant and kind of make them like medicinally like effective for certain diseases. But it also kind of like happens to, like, if you kind of look at it, the raw material, when you pretty much take that bud off, there would be a acid form of the CBG, the THCA, CBD, and the acid form of the CBC. And when you heat them up, you get the delta 9 THC that is used, the CBD that's more stable, the CBC and the CBG, and we'll get into that a little bit. And then once you age them, you got a little bit of different ones component. So they're not all just like that in a plant, but some of the changes of how you work with them will change what's happening. So let's go into a little bit of these ones that are out there. So CBD, CBD is an interesting one. Like, we always want to have a CBD product for our patients, but CBD per se that definitely doesn't really go onto the receptors, the CB1 and the CB2 receptors. It doesn't really want to go on there. It works on it as a negative allosteric modulator. So that means it doesn't really sit, or it sits in there to kind of prevent THC to go crazy on the CB1 receptor and get all the psychoactive activity. So it keeps it a little bit more mellow. So when you want to use your recreational product, it's nice to have a touch of CB1 receptor, CBD in there to keep it a little bit more mellow. And that also inhibits the metabolism of the THC when you take it orally, to not have the more psychoactive component or metabolite of THC that causes more psychoactive activity. Because I look at it very much from the medicinal point of view, and any psychoactive reaction would be considered a side effect, right? What it does though, it inhibits the enzyme that metabolizes the anandamide, and it inhibits anandamide reuptake. So you have more anandamide to then go on the receptor. So what a CBD does, it pretty much acts as an endocannabinoid modulator. So it just helps your own endocannabinoid system to just kind of be happy and kind of do what it's supposed to do with the help of anandamide. It does, on the other hand, work a lot on all these other kind of receptors. So the TRPV1 agonist, so helps with pain, inhibits the tumor necrosis factor alpha. It activates the serotonin receptor and inhibits the voltage-gated calcium channels, just like gabapentin does. And it inhibits the glutamate neurotoxicity, which is good for epilepsy, correct? And inhibits the adenosine transporter. So you kind of see it might work different on our endocannabinoid system, but the endocannabidome part of it, it really has an impact. THC, on the other hand, really works on the CB1 and CB2 receptor, either as an agonist or partial agonist, and inhibits all that inflammatory component of the endocannabidome. So the prostaglandin synthesis, the lipoxygenase, inhibits the glutamate release. So that means also that central sensitization and wind-up effect can be blocked a little bit. Strong component of the serotonin system, and then dopaminergic, stimulates the opioid receptors and neuroprotective antioxidant. So THC has a lot of good things when you look at it from a receptor point of view for inflammation, especially. So the acid form, you'll see more and more of that as well. It's not supposed, like usually we think it is not as stable, and that's why you don't see it in your in the bottles very much for the pets. But THCA does not cross the blood-brain barrier, but has a lot of the other receptors, anti-inflammatory effects that we like about THC. Same with the CBDA, actually works really well on some of the anti-inflammatory effects. CBC is often co-administered for THC, with THC for the inflammation as well. but as it has some anti-inflammatory and analgesic properties. CBG, my favorite one, strong analgesic anti-arrhythmic, like edema and lipoxygenase agent. Lot of components that have anti-inflammatory, but also muscle relaxant effects. So you have your Metacam, but you have your Rheumacam component in there as well. Does it make sense? So you have like the TRPV and TRPA activation, which really blocks that pain response, especially that sharp response. CBN is used, actually was just a byproduct because it was stored too high, but then they realized it actually still has some potency of that THC, and it's used a lot from the anti-inflammatory component for topical application, especially for burn treatments, but it also is used in research for the anticonvulsive effects on that one. The CBDV, it crosses the blood-brain barrier, but it doesn't have the psychoactive effects. And that's the one that most research is looking at with CBD together on the anti-seizure effect, especially for focal seizures. So very interesting cannabinoid for different components. The terpenes promotes, so what the terpenes do, and most of you probably know that anyway, but it's like the smelly part of the plant, right? But that does have therapeutic effects as well. It's pretty much a group of volatile unsaturated hydrocarbons, and they're on a lot of plants actually, and that's where we do the essential oils from. They do smell strongly, so they keep the plant protected from any, bacteria or anyone else that doesn't really feel like smelling it, from destroying it. It seems like they have low concentrations, but they actually have quite potent effects. So you've heard probably about the alpha-pinene, linalool, beta-carotene, myrcene, and limonene. And they all, like, so if you look at myrcene, for example, they actually have opioid type analgesic effect that can be blocked with naloxone. So it must go on the opioid receptors, and also has anti-inflammatory effect. It does work also on the alpha-2s, just like your dexmedetomidine, and has sedative and analgesic effects. And has some muscle relaxant effects. So it's the same as like it is in hops. So you kind of like that same similar smell and similar effects. Beta-carotene, and you kind of see that when you look at, that's probably the most potent anti-inflammatory terpene in it. It really reduces immune inflammatory process, especially by the prostaglandin E2 blockage, and it doesn't have like what we know Metacam does it too, but it really has also gastrocytoprotective properties, which is quite fascinating. Alpha-pinene, bronchodilatory, often used for asthma. Linalool, very much used for calming, as well as anticonvulsant effects due to the parts of it. Flavonoids are pretty much your colors or your pigments of any of the nutrients that we have out there, our plants, vegetable, and fruits. And it kind of is just there for UV protection, but also attracting the pollinators. And there's 20 different flavonoids identified in the cannabis plant, and they also have quite interesting therapeutic effects. So there's different classes, and then you can see the natural resources of all these classes that are out there would be any nuts and fruits and vegetables. So quite interesting when you delve into it. This review article is very fascinating about anything you want to know about the flavonoids. The biological effects of flavonoids are mainly related to the ability to modulate the very cell level signaling cascade. And they have been studied, so that I'm not just making this up, but they have been studied to kind of look at the benefits of showing that they have anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, antifungal, antibacterial, anti-cancer, and anti-allergic activity. Sorry. So the ones that are in the cannabis plants is quercetin, which has some effects. Is also found in green tea, red berries, red wine, and berries. Has antiviral, anti-cancer effect. Arpigenin, that's also found in parsley, celery, and chamomile, with also anti-inflammatory and anti-anxiety effects. Beta testosterone is already sounds like cholesterol. It reduces actually the blood cholesterol, and we know that it's in nuts like almonds, for example, as well. Canaflavin is the one that is unique to cannabis and has a strong anti-inflammatory component. And when you look at Ethan Russell's paper about, which this paper it is, Cannabis Pharmacology, the usual suspects and a few promising leads, he's talking about the flavonoids, and they have looked at canflavin to actually really block the PGE2 effect for the anti-inflammatory component, as well as kind of looking at some of the log system. So very fascinating parts that we learn more and more about it. And when you kind of look at all the cannabis plant and all these different cannabinoids, I think it brings back home that the plant itself, like a lot of our botanical kind of medicine, is pretty much a polypharmacy pharmacy with synergistic effects between the different components to really kind of help instead of just doing one at the time. So looking at all the different components that can help kind of our own endocannabinoid system to figure things out a little bit. So you can see that there's room for therapeutic research to combining all these different cannabinoids and making chemovar that is very specific to very specific disease, specific deficiencies, or even specific species. And I think that's where the research is going right now. When you look at neurodegenerative diseases or epilepsy, you would find one with certain kind of cannabinoids in there, or a product that looks at those specific components to help with that. I think it's very fascinating of like where this is going to go, especially on a preventative component, but also on a treatment component. So I know that was not basic at all, but you stuck with me. I think most of you at least did. So in summary, I think the endocannabinoid system is incredible complex. It is incredible confusing, but it is very fascinating and intriguing. And I hope, you know, belly up, it's definitely not the easiest one, but I hope I got you inspired to read more about it. And I'm more than happy to answer some questions. And
All right, and joining us here today, we have Dr. Connie Mosley here to answer any of your questions. So if you have any questions, be sure to drop those down into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. All right, and welcome, Dr. Mosley.
Hi, how are you?
Not bad, how are you?
Good, thank you.
All right, so we are still waiting on questions here. If anyone has those, be sure to put those down in the bottom. But I think as well, if you want to turn on your camera, you can do that as well.
It said unable to start videos, so on your side.
In the meantime, is there anything that you, looking back on your presentation, would like to add, or any frequently asked questions that you usually get with this topic?
Besides listening to my own voice and hearing myself saying fascinating a million times, I think, you know, taking back, it is a complex study. It's a very complex topic. It's very fascinating, but on the other side, you know, there is a lot of questions that are still to be answered. So I understand, you know, even like not having any questions, because it is seemed to be a bit overwhelming, but I think, you know, understanding how the endocannabinoid system works on your body will make it easier to make those decisions of what to suggest for any pet owners in regards to their species when you're trying to guide them when they're decided to use cannabis for their pets. So, you know, anytime you have questions in regards to a case, please feel free to, you know, contact me offline, contact us through the CAVCM website, and we'll be happy to help you. I understand, you know, some of the questions might come a little bit later, or when you have a specific case to deal with.
All right, perfect. And do you want to give any contact information if people do want to reach out to you with further questions?
Yeah, either through the 44, the VCA Canada 44 email, or if you just do the CAVCM website, you'll find a lot of information there, cavcm.com. I'll just put it on here. That website will have contact information as well as a lot of other information. And you can sign up as a member. You'll get weekly updates on what's going on the research and in our, in this area, which is a growing, fascinating topic.
All right, perfect. So I'm still not seeing any questions in the chat, but is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up here today?
I think there's a lot of other good topic lectures on this topic, so listen into the other ones, and if you have questions, feel free to contact us.